abducted us and they tortured us very badly. Well, my name is Ben Freeth and I live in Zimbabwe. I am from here. I've been here ever since I was a little child, and we were farming out in about 100 kilometers southwest of the capital Harare, but we now live in Harare because we are unable to farm at this time.
So can you tell us the story about what happened with your family farm?
Yeah, it's a long story and a sad story. Our farm was called Mount Carmel Farm, and it was situated 100 kilometers southwest of the capital Harare in Zimbabwe. And it was a beautiful place. It was a place of sanctuary. We had about 500 people living on the farm, farm workers and their families. And my father-in-law was a great conservationist, and so he brought animals onto the farm and built a safari lodge on the farm, and we had international clients from all over the world that used to come there and see the giraffe and the sable and the waterbuck and all the various different animals that we had on the farm. And then we had a lot of fruit, so we used to export mangoes and citrus to Europe and the Middle East and even the Far East. So it was a beautiful place, a place of hope, a place where our children grew up and where we believed that we could stay and help continue to build this beautiful country, Zimbabwe, from there. And then, of course, in 1999, from being a one-party state, suddenly an opposition party was formed, and within really a year of the opposition party being formed, all hell was let loose, because unfortunately we had many people on our farms as white people. Maybe 20% of the population lived on commercial farms and worked on commercial farms, and that was the swing vote that had to be brought into fear so that no opposition could come onto the farms and campaign for change and for a new government. And so we, from the year 2000, we had these land invasions that began, and from there, for the last 18 years, it's been a story of lawlessness and of tragedy on farm after farm after farm after farm.
So you had to leave your farm?
We eventually had to leave in 2009, but it was a long story. We stayed and we fought, and we knew that we couldn't fight this in the physical in any way, because whenever we had problems, when our workers were beaten up, when we were beaten up, when we had situations of violence and intimidation that happened all the time, the police would just say, sorry, there's nothing that we can do, this is political. When our animals were shot, I remember one incident where my father-in-law actually caught the poachers that were killing the animals, and he caught them red-handed with our beautiful animals in the back of their vehicle in a pickup truck, and they tied him up and they took him to the police station, and we didn't know where he was, and we eventually went to the police to find out whether they had heard where he might be, and there he was behind the counter an old man, all tied up, and the police had actually arrested him rather than the poachers. I mean, that was the situation that we have been facing in Zimbabwe all these years, where you report a crime and you're the one that's arrested. I mean, I remember one of our workers once, he was very badly assaulted and got a fractured skull, and was thrown into a fire by the invaders at the hands of a government minister who was trying to take the farm. And the invaders just took him to the police station, and the police grabbed, my sister-in-law was actually in the police station at the time, and she witnessed this. The police grabbed him by the hair and slammed his head against the wall. By then he had already got a fractured skull, and my sister-in-law, and he was unconscious. And my sister-in-law just pleaded with the police, and eventually, after a long time, was allowed to take him to the hospital. But he was the one that was arrested. You know, the victim, the guy with the cracked skull, was the guy that was put in jail. And the invaders were allowed to carry on beating up our workers, carry on stealing all our crops, carry on killing all our animals, carry on beating us up and our workers, and eventually burning our houses down, and no one was ever arrested.
But there were some white farmers when the land grab started who was shot. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, right at the beginning, they tried to make an example of various farmers from different regions, so that we knew that there would be nothing that we could do to actually stop what was going on. And so I remember the first farmer that was killed was a guy called Dave Stevens, and he had made the mistake of supporting the opposition openly, which, when you've got a dictatorship, is not a wise thing to do. And they came after him, and he managed to get away, and he eventually took refuge in the police station. And they just came into the police station, and in front of the police they abducted him, and they took him away from the police station without the police doing anything at all to stop them. And he was shot dead after being brutally tortured. And that was a message to all of us. And then the authorities came and said that he deserved what had happened to him. You know, so from the very top, we were told that we deserved to be shot and tortured if we supported the opposition in any way. And we were branded as the enemies of the state because of the color of our skin. From the very top, from our president, he branded us as enemies of the state.
So you could not expect any help from the police?
No, I mean, I remember a few days after that incident with Dave Stevens, I had another friend, Martin Olds, who, from the south of the country, and he was actually a very brave man. He had saved a man from the jaws of a crocodile at one time, and received a medal for valor from the president himself, from President Mugabe. And I think maybe he was chosen because of that, as someone that they then wanted to kill, because they came to his gate. He went out to meet them, and was greeted with a bullet in his leg. He retreated into his house, and he decided, well, I have to try and fight these guys off. There were about 70 of them, all armed with guns, AK-47s and things. And he was alone in the house, and he fought, and he managed to get a radio message out to his neighbors to try and come and help. Some of them got together and they tried to come along the road, but the police had actually put a roadblock along the road to stop any neighbors coming to his assistance. And he fought a battle for, I think, about 4 hours. And eventually they set the house on fire. He retreated into the bathroom, ran the bath, and tried to get into the bath, but there was a sniper up on a water tank who managed to shoot him, and then they just bludgeoned him, dragged him out of the house and just bludgeoned him with big iron bars until his body was seriously mutilated. And those pictures went out to all of us, and we realized, you know, there's no way that you can fight a system when the police and the army and the secret police are actually involved with killing people for trying to defend their homes and trying to defend themselves.
You also said that some white farmers were put in jail. Can you tell us more about that?
So the initial phase of the land invasions was to bring fear, and everyone knew that it was unlawful, that it was wrong, and the international community came down very strong on the Zimbabwe government for what they were doing. So then they tried to start to legalize what they were doing, and they started to change the courts, change the law, change the constitution, create an infrastructure, if you like, within which they could do what was unlawful and wrong. And so we took a case into the Supreme Court of Zimbabwe, the High Court of Zimbabwe at first, and then the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court was actually invaded. The judges had to run out the back. Some of them were actually beaten over the head. And the police just allowed this to happen. And then the judges were intimidated and they had to resign. So most of the judges that were independent judges were forced out of office, and then they were replaced by people that were party members so that they could do the party's will. And we ended up with a situation where we knew that the courts were now stacked against us. And then of course they started giving out farms to all the judges so that they would then be further compromised. And then they started changing the law so that we would be criminals if we carried on living in our homes and carried on farming in a country which by this stage was needing massive amounts of food aid every year, where the people would be starving if the international community did not come and feed the people of Zimbabwe. And this was from a situation where Zimbabwe had been the breadbasket of Africa. And so they made a law where we would face 2 years in jail if, after having our farm listed in the newspaper, we were still on our farm after 90 days. And we were assured by the government that this law would not come into force so long as we didn't go to the courts, so long as we didn't speak to any media about the terrible things that were happening in Zimbabwe. And I was very vocal. I said, we cannot stop going to the courts, we cannot stop speaking to the media, we have to expose the things that are wrong. There's no way that they're not going to use this law. They are going to use this law. They have put this law in place for a purpose. And of course, within 90 days, they came around and they started to arrest all of our friends. Some people they gave 24 hours to get off the farm. Other people they just arrested and they put them in jails, and we didn't know how long that they were going to be in the jails. It could be up to 2 years, and those jails are terrible places. You know, you are lying on the concrete, on the floor. You are only allowed one item of clothing on your top and one item on the bottom. You don't have any shoes on. It goes down to 0 degrees here in the winter time. There's no pillows or anything like that. There's one blanket maybe between 3 or 4 people, and the jails were so squashed that you had to lie, and you were packed like sardines in a can together, and when one person wanted to turn over, everyone had to turn over. You know, these kind of situations are not good, particularly when you're old, and everyone knew that there would be a death sentence for many people. So that was basically what created the panic that cleared the farms of us as white people. That was back in 2002. We stayed on. We tried to defend ourselves in court. We got various provisional orders in the High Court, and we eventually took a case that challenged this whole law. And then with challenging that whole law, so of course, you know, they never produced that bit of paper when we got to the court. My mother-in-law and father-in-law were too badly beaten to go to the court. I got to the court in a wheelchair, and we had the hearing, and the Zimbabwe government, when it came to the contempt issue, because we took them on a contempt order as a result of the intimidation and the beating and everything, we were told that the court had ordered in a provisional order previous to that we should be protected, that our workers should be protected, that we should be allowed to live in our home, that we should be allowed to farm. And so when it got to the contempt side of the fact that the Zimbabwe government had not protected us, in fact my wife had gone to the police had just laughed at her when she had reported what was happening. And the whole community in fact had gone to the police station, and they all knew where we had been taken, to this torture camp, but the police refused to go to rescue us. And it was only by God's grace that we actually survived that night. But when it got to that contempt part of the hearing in the court, the Zimbabwe government lawyers all just walked out of court, and it was a real show of their contempt for the rule of law, their contempt for international law, their contempt for human rights, and the fact that we live in Zimbabwe still to this day without the rule of law, without human rights, in a kind of quasi-dictatorship that's dressed up as democracy, and we continue to live there, you know, even after the election 2 days ago, where we were just hoping for some kind of break, some kind of change, some kind of hope to be able to go forward.
What would you like to say to the Swedish government who supported Mugabe?
Well, the Swedish government were obviously very instrumental in Mugabe coming to power originally in 1980. And one of the things that the Swedish government did was that they insisted upon an internationally run election. They realized that the Rhodesian government running the election was not going to be good for democracy. And so they insisted on a United Nations run election. But ever since then we've had election after election which is run by a Marxist one-party state, which is there to make sure that they get back into power at any cost. And so we've seen through election after election many people being killed, tens of thousands of people being tortured. We've seen rigging on massive scale, and yet there's no call by the international community to run an election like they did in 1980, where it's internationally run, where the people are not suffering, where the will of the people is allowed to be heard. I think Joseph Stalin once said that it doesn't count the people that are making the vote. The only thing that counts is the people that are counting the vote. And if you've got dishonest people counting the vote, as we have at the moment, you're always going to end up with the result that they want. And that's the situation that we're in now. So we want a chance from the international community to have a free and fair election where the will of the people is actually allowed to be expressed, and the counting is done in a fair and transparent manner. That's all we want.
What would happen if you were to go to your farm today?
I'd be intimidated. We've got a final and binding judgment from the SADC tribunal to say that we should be allowed to farm our farm, that we should be allowed to live in our houses, that we should be protected there. But we know that if we did try to go there, we would be intimidated and that we would be hounded out in the same way as we've been hounded out in the past. We did try to, when they burnt our houses down, we did try and rebuild some of our workers' houses that had also been burnt down, and they just came and they burnt those houses down again as well. So we realized that there was no hope to actually go back farming while we don't have human rights in this country, while we don't have the rule of law in this country, while judgments that are international judgments are not being respected. And so that's another thing that we would like for the Swedish government to say, you know, come on, Zimbabwe, you are in contempt of court. We can't support governments that are not doing things according to the law. This is a court that was set up in Africa, judged by African judges, an African solution for an African problem, and yet the world doesn't want to recognize it, and they don't want to push it. They recognize it, but they don't want to push it, and I think it's because we're white, essentially, but it's also because they're intimidated by the regime, and they don't have a stomach to actually stand up for justice against corrupt and evil regimes.
So why did you choose to stay and fight instead of leaving Zimbabwe?
I don't blame anyone who has left Zimbabwe. I think they've left for very good reasons. They want to live in countries where there is a freedom, where there is no fear, where they don't have everything that they've ever worked for stolen by a regime that is corrupt and evil. So I don't blame anyone that's left, and 25% of the entire population of Zimbabwe has left the country. As white people, well over 90% of the white people have left Zimbabwe, and it's for good reason. From our point of view, we decided to stay to try and make some kind of difference for the good of Zimbabwe, for the future of Zimbabwe. We love this country and we believe in a future for this country. And in bad situations, if everyone is always to just leave, then bad situations will always get worse and prevail and become worse. And so just like in Sweden, you know, I'm sure that there would be many Swedish people, if things got bad like they have got bad here, a lot of people would decide to stay and fight and try and make sure that there was a future for the next generation. But it's been a long haul, and we're all very tired now.
How is the general situation in Zimbabwe with grain and the farms?
We need food aid each year, which is very sad, from a country that used to be very productive and that used to be the breadbasket, known as the breadbasket of Africa, to have a situation where we need food aid every year from the international community is ridiculous. You know, it should not be. We need to get to a situation where there is rule of law, where there's property rights, where individual people, whether they be black or whether they be white, if they're on the land, they need to have title deeds so that they can know that they've got a future, that they're not going to be kicked off tomorrow if they don't support the ruling party, which is what happens today. And we need that security so that people can invest and people can make sure that agriculture can be rebuilt after the destruction that we've seen over all these years. You know, we've seen every single one of our animals on the farm killed. There's of over 500 animals, giraffe and sable and waterbuck and everything else. There's not one left. You know, we've seen our trees, 40,000 fruit trees, almost all of them are now dead. They've just allowed the fires to go through every year. They haven't protected the trees from those fires. They haven't irrigated the trees. They haven't protected those trees from disease. Most of those trees are all dead. You know, not a single mango has been exported since we left the farm in 2009. We need to rebuild those things if we're going to create jobs, if we're going to create hope, if we're going to create a tax base for education to be financed, for health to be financed, for the infrastructure of the country to be rebuilt. We can't just rely on the Swedish taxpayer to do those things for us.
You just had your elections here. What do you think about the outcome as far as you know?
You know, we've only had 7 results, I think, that have been officially announced, but we know a lot of the results already, and we live in a country that's not transparent, but we have contacts in the friendly contacts in the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission and in the army and in amongst the authorities, and it seems like it's a landslide victory for the ruling party. We know that this is not a true reflection of what the people have voted, and we're very sad. You know, all we want is truth, an end to this deceit. You know, the headline in the state newspaper, the Herald today, is landslide victory for ZANU-PF, for the ruling party. You know, if that was the case, and it was the will of the people, you'd see jubilation in the streets. And all you see is long faces and people looking depressed because they know that it's not a reflection of reality. And so it's a sad day today. It's another black day when we face 5 years again of the status quo, 5 years of no protection from the rule of law, where court judgments are not respected, where we need food from the international community, where we can't have a vision to plan and build and do the things that we want to do for the good of everyone.
So the situation for the white farmers, they will not improve then, you think?
I think, you know, for those that are prepared to work with the system and ensure that they do what the system wants them to do, which is allow corruption to continue, pay corruption money, then I think there could be a plan for a while. But for those of us that believe in doing things in a proper way, without corruption, without paying people to be allowed to do certain things. I mean, you know, we're not talking just about a few dollars. People are having to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to governors and to authorities to be allowed to farm, all under the table. You know, that's no way to run a country.
So would the opposition have made a difference if they came into power?
I believe they would. You know, Nelson Chamisa is a young man. He would be the president today if the right thing had happened. He's a young man. He has publicly said that he would ensure that court judgments are upheld, particularly our SADC tribunal judgment. He mentioned that. And I believe that if we get court judgments upheld, then we can go forward. He has also suffered under the regime. He has suffered a fractured skull, just like I have. He knows what to live under dictatorship is, and he wants to bring freedom to the people of Zimbabwe. So I believe that he really would have made a difference. He's got a legal background as well. and he's got a charisma about him and a hope about him, and he is of the new generation. So I really believe that he would have made a difference, but I cannot see that under the status quo we're going to see any real change. They've got so much blood on their hands, and they do not want to free things up just in case maybe justice comes their way, or there is some kind of accountability. They do not want the culture of impunity, which has become so strong in Zimbabwe, where you can get away literally with murder, to change, because that's how they've got to power, that's how they've stayed in power, that's how they will continue to remain in power.
So how was life in Rhodesia if you compare to the life you have in Zimbabwe today?
Well, it was a long time ago that Rhodesia was in existence. 1980 was 38 years ago, and so in many people's memories Rhodesia doesn't even exist. In fact, in my own memory, we only, as a family, got to Zimbabwe just after independence, so I never actually lived in Rhodesia, but I've read a lot about Rhodesia. I've talked to a lot of people about what life was like in those days, and I think the facts very much speak for themselves in terms of what Rhodesia achieved in economic terms, in building a country from where there was essentially no infrastructure to a country where there was no written word, there was no hospitals, there was no roads, there was no railways, there was no law courts, there was no, none of these things that we consider to be essential within a country were in existence. They were all built up in a very short period of time. What happened was that, as far as voting was concerned, was that obviously democracy was something very new to Africa at that time. There'd never been democracy in Africa, and what was brought into place was a qualified voting system depending on your level of education. And Zimbabwean black population, or Rhodesian black population, had the highest level of education in the whole of Africa at that time. Depending on your level of education and depending on your responsibility within society, if you paid certain taxes, and you were given a bigger vote than if you paid no taxes and didn't have responsibility in society. And so, just like in other countries around the world, even Western countries, I think it was only in 1948 that Britain did away with the qualified voting system, where a professor would have a bigger vote than an ordinary person. And then eventually they made it equal, so that a professor became an ordinary person with every other ordinary person. But in Zimbabwe it was recognized that because it was, or Rhodesia, because it was new to democracy, they had to have a qualified voting system. But the West didn't accept that. They said that no, it had to be one man, one vote. Whether you could read or write, whether you understood economic policies, whether you could make an informed choice or not, you had to have the same vote as anyone else. And so that was really the big issue when it came to the fight, I suppose, for this majority rule, this one man, one vote system. And I'm going to say something very controversial. I don't believe that Africa was ready for one man, one vote at that time. the education levels were not great enough, and the understanding of democracy, the education regarding democracy, was not great enough. And as a result, we saw not democracy take the place of colonialism, but dictatorship in a very brutal way. You know, we saw not just tens of thousands of people murdered by regimes, not just hundreds of thousands of people, but millions of people were murdered by regimes through Africa as a result of democracy. And, you know, that was a disaster for the people of Africa. And it's something that we need to come to terms with if we want to learn from history and we want to understand what the West did wrong, and why it's so important that we don't do things just out of idealistic, highfalutin kind of aims. We look at the practicalities of systems and whether they fit within countries, because when millions of people are getting murdered as a result of this ideal, it's not in the interest of the people of Africa.
What would you want the West to be?
Well, I think we've got to the stage now where the people of Zimbabwe are ready for democracy, but the West don't want to give us democracy because they don't want to make sure that there is a free and fair election which is run by people that are impartial, that are not just an arm of the ruling party. And we've got a situation in Zimbabwe today where the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission is just an arm of the ruling party, where the police is an arm of the ruling party, where the army is an arm of the ruling party, and they're the guys that are running the election. And we're not going to have any kind of result that is different from the ruling party is back in power. We want democracy. We want truly one man, one vote. I think it's important that, unlike South Africa, where there were specific apartheid laws that separated black people from white people, and black people weren't allowed into certain places and weren't allowed to do certain things in South Africa. In Rhodesia it was different. There was a very much more inclusive society where black people were in the army. In fact, the majority of the special forces units were made out of black people. There were a lot of black people in the army, in education, in all sorts of different fields that was growing all the time, coming into business, coming into agriculture, coming into all sorts of different fields. And you remember, you know, it was only a few years before that Africa was in a state where there were no clothes, there were just skins, there was no written language, there was no currency. So it had come from a place where Europe had been, you know, many centuries before, to a place where there were teachers, black teachers in the schools, black people in the armed forces, black people in the parliament even, black people allowed to vote. It wasn't the kind of situation where it wasn't moving towards a fully inclusive society where everyone would be completely equal. You know, as people were coming out of poverty, as people were coming out of ignorance, as people were being educated, they were taking their place in society just like everyone else.